The deserts of Erythra were a study in extremes. Gale-force winds swept up fine grains of blood-red sand, battering the exterior of the research station like an endless, corrosive tide. Inside the facility's reinforced walls, Dr. Marin Dax sat hunched over the glowing surface of her holodouble, oblivious to the storm outside. The holodouble projected a lattice of rotating helixes and molecular structures, the biological fingerprint of a specimen that had become her obsession over the last 12 weeks. This particular strand of DNA, labeled HX humanoid by the colony's archival system, had been found in a fragment of petrified bone unearthed deep in the Dracaris mines. At first, the find had been dismissed as another anomaly, just another piece of ancient life on a planet that had long since been scoured clean by its punishing climate. But as Dax sequenced the material, she began to notice patterns she had never seen before. Genes that could rapidly switch on and off. Sequences that seemed to anticipate environmental stress and adapt on the fly. If her readings were correct, this organism wasn't merely surviving, it was designed to thrive under conditions that would annihilate most known life forms. "Marin, you've been at that for hours," called a voice from across the lab. It was Dr. Colin Hurst, her colleague and frequent reminder that other people existed in the world. "You can't unravel an entire genome without sleep." "I'm not trying to unravel it," Dax muttered, her fingers dancing across the holodouble controls. "I'm trying to understand why it's the way it is. It's like the DNA knows what's coming and prepares for it. Like it's aware." Hurst sighed. "You know what I think? I think you've got desert brain. Too much isolation, not enough real food, and way too much staring at glowing spirals." Dax shook her head. "You don't get it. This thing, if it's from an extinct species, it's a species we've never cataloged before. And if it's not extinct..." She let the thought trail off, unwilling to voice the implications. Before Hurst could retort, the station's internal alarm system blared to life. The harsh, staccato sound cut through the conversation, followed by a metallic voice: "Perimeter breach detected. Lockdown initiated." Dax's eyes snapped to the holodouble's terminal as security alerts scrolled across the screen. The perimeter cameras were down, replaced by lines of static. Thermal sensors picked up multiple heat signatures moving too fast toward the facility. Hurst stood frozen, clutching a data pad. "What the hell is it? We don't have any indigenous predators left this close to the station." Dax hurried to the console and tapped into the secondary sensor grid. The visual feeds were offline, but the audio channels still worked. The lab filled with distorted screeches and guttural growl sounds that didn't match any known wildlife. She felt the hair on her arms rise. "It's not wildlife," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's something else." The station's security team, a small group of engineers and scientists trained in basic defense protocols, scrambled to their posts. Automated turrets deployed at the main entrance, their barrels glowing faintly as they locked onto the incoming heat signatures. The researchers and crew had grown accustomed to periodic sandstorms and equipment failures, but this was different. The speed and coordination of the approaching figures suggested intelligence. Dax glanced back at the holodouble, her mind racing. Was it possible that what she'd been studying wasn't just a relic? Could it be connected to whatever was now bearing down on them? She'd read the data 100 times, but now a chilling realization dawned on her: the genes she had been analyzing weren't just evolutionary artifacts. They were active. They were alive. The screeches outside intensified, growing closer. The sound of metal on metal rang out as something or several somethings began testing the outer doors. Dax turned to Hurst, who looked pale under the sterile glow of the lab lights. "Get the backup drives," Dax said firmly. "If this station goes down, we can't lose the data. Whatever's out there, it's connected to this genome. It has to be." Hurst nodded mutely and started gathering portable storage units. Dax remained rooted at the holodouble, staring at the frozen helix on the screen. The organism she had been studying was no longer an academic curiosity. It had come to their doorstep, not as a discovery, but as a predator. By morning, the research station was still in lockdown. The automated turrets had gone silent hours ago, their ammunition depleted. Dr. Marin Dax sat at the lab's central console, the glow of the holodeble reflecting off her drawn face. Around her, the remaining crew moved in hushed, hurried motions, patching breaches in the bulkheads and rerouting power to critical systems. Dax's mind raced as she reviewed the night's data. The security footage had been corrupted, the drones disabled. All that remained were fragmented logs from motion sensors and thermal scans. The intruders, those humanoid figures, had moved with alarming speed, tearing through the station's outer defenses in coordinated strikes. Whatever they weren't just predators. They were organized. She brought up the genetic profile of the HX humanoid specimen again, overlaying it with the thermal images from the attack. The match was unmistakable. The intruders shared the same DNA signature as the sample she had been analyzing. But that sample had been centuries old. The implications were staggering. "It doesn't make sense," she muttered. "This thing should be extinct, long gone. How can they be here now? They're here because someone wanted them here." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Reyes, the station's head of security. He stood by the doorway, his rifle slung over one shoulder and his face grim. Whatever those things are, they didn't just evolve out of the dirt. Someone let them loose. Dax glanced up at him. "We don't have proof of that." "Yet," he replied. "But you've seen the way they move, the way they think. That's not random evolution. That's by design." A chill ran through her. Reyes was right, of course. The genetic markers she had seen, those rapid response sequences, the adaptive enzymes, the unnervingly efficient neural structures, didn't look like the product of natural selection. They looked engineered. "Even if that's true," Dax said slowly, "why release them on a colony planet? Erythra 4 is no test ground. It's our home. What's the endgame here?" Reyes shrugged. "I don't know, document. But I do know this: if we don't figure out what makes them tick, we're not going to last much longer. That first attack was just them testing the waters." Dax nodded reluctantly and turned back to the console. She began cross-referencing the DNA data with the limited environmental scans from the night's attack. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The intruders had systematically targeted their power grid, communications array, and even their water purification system. They weren't just attacking blindly, they were dismantling the colony's ability to sustain life. And then there was the way they hunted. The thermal readings showed how the creatures had encircled their targets, flanking them and striking from multiple angles. It wasn't the behavior of mindless beasts. It was strategic, almost military in its precision. Dax leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The old HX humanoid sample had been a curiosity, a scientific puzzle. But now that same genetic code was walking, thinking, and killing right outside their walls. And it was evolving. She thought back to the first time she had seen the DNA sequence under the holodable's analysis lens. She had been fascinated by its elegance, its complexity. Now, that same fascination felt like a trap. The very characteristics that made the sample so remarkable, its adaptability, its intelligence, were the reasons they were in danger. As the day wore on, Dax found herself drawn to the classified archives in the colony's database. They were encrypted and heavily restricted, but if there was even a hint of where these beings had come from, she had to find it. With Reyes' reluctant permission, she initiated the decryption sequence, the console screen flickering as the hidden files unlocked one by one. What she uncovered was more disturbing than she could have imagined. Centuries-old records from the initial colonization efforts detailed a secret Project One designed to create the ultimate adaptive organism. A creature that could endure any environment, outthink any predator, and survive any catastrophe. The records were incomplete, but the project's name stood out clearly: Homo Ultimus. Dax stared at the screen, her heart pounding. It wasn't just the name that unnerved her. It was the language in the documents, the cold, clinical way the researchers had described their work. Subject shows remarkable predatory instinct. unparalleled adaptability, intelligence exceeding baseline human metrics. She slumped back in her chair, the weight of the revelation sinking in. These creatures weren't just a product of chance. They were humanity's legacy, a legacy that had somehow returned, centuries after it should have been forgotten. As the station's alarm system began another cycle of alerts, Dax knew the truth was out in the open. Homo Ultimus was no longer a scientific anomaly. It was a threat, one that would not stop until it had reclaimed the land it was designed to conquer. Dax's shoulders were heavy with exhaustion. The once orderly research station had transformed into a militarized bunker. Barricades had gone up in every corridor, and a frantic energy permeated the air as the remaining crew prepared for yet another assault. Plasma turrets hummed at every entrance, and automated drones buzzed through the hallways. Yet Dax knew that none of it would be enough. As the hours dragged on, the team received an urgent transmission from the capital colony, Caliban's Rest. The governor's voice crackled over the comms. "Dr. Dax, we're facing an escalating crisis. The reports confirm the same species you've encountered, humanoids exhibiting extreme predatory behavior. We've lost 3 mining outposts in the past 48 hours. They're not just killing, they're taking things. Salvaging parts, using tools. It's as if they're learning." Dax tightened her grip on the edge of the console. Learning what? That's just it. Every strike they make, they adapt. Security protocols that worked last week are useless now. Our sentry drones, they disable them in minutes. Our heavy troopers are being outmaneuvered. This is beyond an infestation, Doctor. It's a war. The word hit her like a blow. A war. A conflict not against an invading force, but against something far more terrifying, a species that had no need for war machines, no standing armies. Their weapons were their minds, their ability to evolve faster than any system designed to contain them. "I need to go out there," Dax said, more to herself than to the governor. "We need more data. We need to understand them before it's too late." Reyes, standing at the doorway with his rifle, scoffed. "Going out there is suicide. And staying in here while they close the noose isn't?" Dax snapped back. "If we don't find out what drives them, what they want, what they're capable of, then we're done." Reyes glared at her, then shook his head. "Fine. But you're not going alone. We'll take a squad." As much as she hated the idea of dragging more people into the crosshairs, Dax knew she'd need protection. She reluctantly nodded, and within the hour, she, Reyes, and a small contingent of armed engineers set out into the dunes. The air outside was a storm of choking red sand, visibility barely more than a few meters. The team moved cautiously, scanning every rock formation and crevice for signs of the intruders. Thermal scanners lit up with sporadic heat signatures, but each time the team approached, they found only decoys, heat-generating devices cobbled together from stolen equipment. "They're playing with us," Reyes muttered. "Drawing us out." Dax crouched by one of the decoys, examining it closely. This isn't just random scavenging. They know exactly what they're doing. They're using our own tech against us. The realization unsettled her. The intruders were more than just fast and strong, they were methodical. They didn't simply adapt in the evolutionary sense. They learned in real time, applying strategy, testing responses, and refining their approach. They were becoming something more than hunters. They were problem solvers. And that made them terrifying. The team pressed on, eventually reaching the jagged ruins of an old mining outpost. Half buried under layers of sand, the structures looked deserted. But Dax's instincts told her otherwise. She raised a hand, signaling the group to stop. "Something's here," she whispered. Her fingers tightened on the handheld scanner, its readings fluctuating erratically. The DNA signature she had grown all too familiar with was pulsing on the display, impossibly close. As the group advanced carefully, the first attack came with no warning. One of the engineers was yanked into the shadows by a blur of motion, his scream cut short. Plasma fire erupted in all directions as the team scrambled to respond, but their attackers moved like specters, striking from impossible angles and disappearing just as quickly. Dax pressed herself against a rock face, heart pounding. In the chaos, she caught her first clear glimpse of one, a humanoid figure, sinewy and lean, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It moved with an eerie combination of grace and brutality, wielding a crude spear fashioned from scavenged materials. As it lunged at Reyes, he fired a burst from his rifle, but the creature twisted mid-air, avoiding the shots with ease. Dax's mind raced. This wasn't random. The creature wasn't just hunting them, it was testing them. It parried strikes, dodged projectiles, and used the terrain to its advantage. Every movement was deliberate, every action calculated. She realized that the stories from the capital colony were true. The humans weren't just predators, they were tacticians. Warriors. Innovators. Fall back. Reyes shouted, pulling Dax out of her trance. The team began a desperate retreat, plasma rounds streaking through the air as the humanoids continued their relentless pursuit. By the time they made it back to the station, only half the team remained. Bloodied and shaken, they collapsed against the reinforced doors as they slammed shut behind them. Reyes slumped to the ground, his rifle falling from his hands. What the hell are we up against? Dax's thoughts were a whirlwind. She hadn't wanted to believe it, but now the truth was undeniable. These beings Homo Ultimus weren't just a threat to the station. They were a threat to everything. They were no longer the hunted. They were the hunters. And they were preparing for something far greater than the small battles that had played out in the deserts. They were preparing to dominate. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her hands trembling. "We're up against ourselves," she said quietly. "Or at least, what we could become. If we were designed to be unstoppable." A heavy silence hung over the research station. The lights flickered intermittently, power cells running low after days of continuous strain. Dr. Marin Dax stared at the data log scrolling across her console. The words blurred together in her mind, lines of text that told a story she wasn't ready to believe. She had always known Erythra 4 was an oddity, a planet with a history buried under layers of blood-red sand. But she hadn't known about this. The classified file she had decrypted made it all too clear: the intruders weren't alien at all. They were human, an offshoot of humanity's earliest spacefaring ventures. The Homo Ultimus project had been the desperate gamble of a radical faction that sought to create a species that could thrive anywhere in the universe, regardless of how hostile or desolate the environment might be. They hadn't just been bioengineers, they had been zealots. Their aim wasn't just survival, but dominance. The record spoke of experimental colonies scattered across fringe worlds. Erythra 4 had been one such experiment, chosen for its brutal conditions. The creators of Homo Ultimus had released their creations here, hoping to observe how they would adapt. In those first decades, they must have seemed like failures. The project leaders abandoned them, believing the creatures hadn't lived up to their promise. But they had underestimated what they had built. They didn't understand that the greatest strength of Homo Ultimus was time. Now, centuries later, time had done its work. The original genetic modifications had continued to refine themselves, honing every biological and cognitive edge. The creatures weren't just survivors anymore, they were the apex of everything humanity had ever feared about its darker potential. They were smarter, faster, more resourceful. And as their numbers grew, they had shifted from mere survival to deliberate conquest. Dax's heart pounded as the last entry in the file played back over the speakers. The voice was old, cracking with age, but the warning was crystal clear: if you find this, if the Ultimus ever make contact, you must contain them at all costs. They are not a species to be reasoned with. They will not coexist. They will consume. Reyes leaned over her shoulder, his expression grim. "So that's it, then? These humans were made to replace us?" "Not replace," Dax said. "They were made to survive where we couldn't. To adapt beyond anything natural. But Their creators didn't think about what that would mean, how it would change them. They're not human anymore, not really. There's something else. Something that wants us dead. Dax looked down at her hands. They were trembling, but she forced herself to speak calmly. It's not just us. If they ever get off-world, they'll spread. They'll see every new environment as a challenge to conquer. Every species as a rival to outmatch. This isn't about survival anymore. This is about control. Reyes let out a slow, steady breath. So how do we stop them? It was the question that had been tearing at her ever since the classified file had unlocked. All the security measures, the turrets, the drones, they only slowed the creatures down. The Homo Ultimus didn't just overcome obstacles, they learned from them, improved themselves, and returned stronger. The usual solutions weren't going to work. If they wanted to survive, they had to think differently. I don't know yet, Dax admitted. But we need to get this data out. The capital colony needs to know what we're dealing with. The other settlements need to know. If we can't stop them here, we at least have to buy time for the rest of the colonies to prepare. Reyes's eyes narrowed. You think they can even be stopped? Dax hesitated. Deep down, she wasn't sure. But what she did know was that doing nothing was no longer an option. We'll find a way, she said. We have to. As the next assault wave struck the station, the team fought with a grim determination born of knowing the stakes. They weren't just fighting for their own lives. They were fighting to ensure that the Homo Ultimus didn't break free, didn't spread their predatory evolution to every corner of the galaxy. The battles were fierce, and the losses mounted. But Dax held onto a fragile thread of hope that, in their efforts to understand the creatures, they might also find their undoing. When the alarms blared again, signaling another breach, Dax stood tall. She wasn't just a scientist anymore. She was part of a resistance, fighting against humanity's own dark legacy.